Hey everybody, it's Thursday, which means it's time for another T-Hawk's 2 cents. And today we're going to do something that's a little bit more intricate. It's basically going to be the anatomy of the back of a belt buckle. So I've been making a couple of belt buckles lately, and I just wanted to share with you, there's some different ways to do the back of a belt buckle. A lot of it's personal preference, but there are some things that you really want to pay attention to make sure that each belt buckle works properly and fits properly. So as many of you know, a belt buckle does serve an actual purpose. It keeps your pants up. So you want it to be able to function for a really long time, to be able to withstand all the pressure and all the use that these belt buckles get. So there's a couple different ways to do the actual loop. You can do a movable loop that actually like moves back and forth and has some give to it. Or you can do a permanent loop where this is actually soldered to the belt buckle like this. It's not moving, it's not doing anything. The only thing you really want to pay attention to, no matter what type of loop you're doing, is you want to make sure that at least 2 of the leather thicknesses can go through that buckle. So you want to make sure that with your loop, 2 leather thicknesses can make it through that loop. If they can't, it's going to be really hard and the belt's going to get stuck and people will get frustrated and then they don't want to wear their belt buckle. Also on the prong, you're going to want to make sure that your prong always has a little bit of a curve to it, so that when it goes into the hole onto the belt buckle, it will catch and it will grab and you'll be able to pull and it won't go anywhere. So you want to make sure that you have a little curve on the back of your belt buckle too. Also, usually what I do, especially if I'm making a belt buckle that has a hinge on the back that's movable, what I do is I use a piece of brass tubing and I cut down the brass tubing. And I make sure that whatever piece of wire I'm sticking in there is a nice snug fit. So generally what I like to use is an 8 gauge brass, because brass will hold up a lot longer than sterling silver will. And 8 gauge is a really nice thick gauge. So you want to make sure that you find a tube that will fit the 8mm in a nice snug way. And I use this both for the loop and for the prong. So if you are soldering a tube to the back of your belt buckle, what I like to do is I will cut it off about 1/4 inch less than whatever the thickness of the leather is. So if I'm using a 1.5 inch leather, I will cut this down at 1.25 inches. It gives the loop a little bit of play to come up over each edge. And then that way, if you leave that gap, you're not left with a lot of like tons of wiggle room here. You don't want it to have too much wiggle room there. A little wiggle room is good, but too much can cause problems and cause the belt buckle not to sit in the right place. So you do want the loop to be as close to 1.5 inches as possible, or whatever your thickness of your belt is. Also, something I'm doing if I am using a tube is I make sure that I always will sand this down on one side so that it's nice and flat. So when you actually do attach it to the back of your piece, there's a nice flat area for it. So you'll get really good capillary traction, which will make that joint a lot stronger, because this is going to take a lot of strain. If you're doing a more permanent loop, I do the same thing where I curve it around, but then I also go through and I file it or sand it on this part that's going to be soldered down to the belt buckle to make it completely flat, so that you get a really nice solid joint, so that that's not going to go anywhere. Once you start using the belt buckle, this will last for a really long time if your joints are done properly and you have really good contact points. Now when you're going to do the prong and you're sticking the prong on your belt buckle, there's a couple different ways you can do this. You can file your prong flat and then solder it down. What I actually like to do is I like to take a ball burr and I like to create a hole that the prong can actually go through and sit in, and then that way it's a lot easier for you to solder it. Just make sure that that hole isn't too big and it's nice and snug. Also, I bend the prong before I solder it in, and I also do take a sandpaper disc and I round out the top. After I bend it, I've round out the top of the prong with a sandpaper disc. So that's all finished before I stick this in, and I leave this a little bit longer. I pop it through the edge here. You can't even tell where I soldered that little bad boy. So creating a hole isn't going to make a huge difference, but basically before, like, you pop it through, a little bit of it will stick out the front, and then when you're ready to polish and you're moving on to that next step, you just cut that extra part off, polish it, and you'll never even be able to see that there was a hole there. So that's how I always put the prong in. I feel like it's a nice way to get it nice and straight, really sturdy, is just by using a bobber and drilling a hole. So the back of a belt buckle is really kind of simple in a mechanical sense, but it's really important that you get these simple parts right. You want to make sure that your prong is always nice and sturdy, and then you want to make sure that your loop is going to be able to stand up to all the wear and tear that a belt buckle will get. So yeah, other than that, that's pretty much the way a belt buckle works. That's different ways that you could do a belt buckle. I'm sure there's more. These are the two ways that I kind of employ to do belt buckle loops. I always do the prongs the same. Just make sure you use a nice heavy gauge wire on the prong. But other than that, that's about it. And if you found this tip helpful, and if you have another tip that you would like me to go over, just email me or DM me, and I will try to get back to that. But other than that, I hope you guys all have a really great week, and I will see you for another episode of T-Hawk's 2 Cents soon.